Last Halloween was supposed to be a blast. I had plans to meet up with friends at a house party. Loud music, dumb costumes, the whole night out. I'd even slept in that morning on purpose, knowing I'd be awake until sunrise. But by midday, the entire plan collapsed. One friend canceled, then another, and eventually the whole thing fell apart. Suddenly I had nothing to do, and way too many hours to fill. The rest of the day dragged on painfully slow. I wandered around my apartment, scrolling on my phone, checking the fridge for no reason, lying on my bed just to get up again. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was the kind of emptiness that makes the walls feel closer than they actually are. By the time night settled, the silence had become almost oppressive. No noise outside, not even passing cars. Just this heavy, stale quiet that made the place feel unfamiliar. As midnight approached, I accepted that sleep wasn't happening anytime soon, so I grabbed a blanket, some snacks, and decided to put on an old horror movie. If nothing else, it would at least distract me from how weirdly empty the night felt. When I settled into my living room, something about the space already felt unusual. My couch wasn't against a wall like in most homes. I had placed it in the center of the room, facing the TV, with an open space behind it that led toward the hallway and the door to the living room. I liked it that way. It made the room feel bigger. Though that night, it also made everything behind me feel uncomfortably open. On my right were the front window, covered by thick curtains I always kept shut after dark. I hated the idea of someone being able to look inside at night without me knowing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't anything obvious. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. It was more like a tension in the air. I kept glancing over my shoulder without meaning to, checking the empty space behind the couch, a space I usually ignored. I tried to focus on the movie, turning the volume up to smother the uneasy quiet pressing around me. And for a little while, it worked. The flickering screen, the crunch of snacks, the cheesy soundtrack, everything felt almost normal again. While I watched the movie, something shifted in the corner of my vision. Just a tiny flicker, near the window. I turned my head toward them. Nothing. The curtains hung perfectly still, heavy and unmoving. I stared for a moment, then shrugged it off and went back to the movie. A few minutes passed. Then it happened again. Another flicker. I leaned forward on the couch, squinting toward the window. Still nothing. But I knew what I saw. It wasn't a trick of the light, or a reflection. Something had moved. Something close enough for the gap in the curtains to catch it. Eventually, I stood up. I didn't know what I expected to find. Probably nothing, just emptiness, proving I'd been jumpy for no reason. I slowly walked toward the window, took a breath, and pulled the curtains aside. What I saw was nothing like what I expected. I expected the darkness to swallow everything. Maybe a quiet street, maybe a stray cat, maybe nothing at all. But instead, I saw a man. He wasn't standing right at my window. He was much farther, out in the middle of the street, directly across from my house, drifting back and forth under the dim glow of a street lamp, dressed in dark clothes that blended into the shadows, the lower part of his face visible, while his eyes were lost in the shadow of what seemed to be a hood. What struck me first was the way he moved. He wasn't walking normally. His steps were uneven, staggering from one side of the road to the other. At first, it seemed obvious. He was drunk. Hammered, actually. Probably coming back from a Halloween party and hopelessly lost. I'd seen people that wasted before. Sloppy, slow, barely aware of their surroundings. I checked the time on my phone. 1:12 a.m. No reason for anyone to be out here now, let alone stumbling around alone like that. I kept watching him for a couple minutes, and then realized that he couldn't have been the source of the movement behind my curtains. He was too far away, I closed the curtains and returned to the couch, trying to pretend the man outside had nothing to do with me. I hadn't even been back on the couch for a full minute when it happened. A knock. The kind of knock someone gives when they already know you're awake. The sound cut straight through the muted tension in the room. I turned off the TV entirely this time, letting the silence stretch out around me. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then came a second knock. A cold wave crawled up my spine. I stood up, not because I wanted to, but because something in me needed to know who, or what, was at my door. I moved into the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. The air felt different there, thicker. When I reached the door, I hesitated. I wasn't going to open it. I just wanted to see, just confirm. I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. It was him, the man from the street. But up close, he looked nothing like he had a few minutes earlier. The way he stood, completely motionless. I backed away from the door slowly, my heartbeat thudding unevenly in my chest. I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want him to know I was there. He didn't knock again. He didn't speak. He didn't shift his weight. He just stood there, staring at the handle, as if he could sense me through the wood. Then, without warning, he moved. Not like a drunk person, not like someone confused or disoriented. He turned sharply and walked away with perfect balance, disappearing beyond the faint reach of the porch light. I stayed frozen for several seconds after he vanished, listening to the silence pressing against the walls. He was gone, but somehow, the house felt even more wrong now. When I was finally sure the man had walked away, I stepped back from the door and just stood there for a moment, listening, half expecting another knock or footsteps coming back up the porch. But nothing happened. The silence returned. I told myself, over and over, that it was finished, that he was gone, that it was just a Halloween drunk who'd mistaken my door for someone else's. I returned to the living room, trying not to look over my shoulder at the empty space behind the couch. I grabbed a glass of wine and sat back down. The cushion felt oddly cold, as if the room itself hadn't warmed in hours. My mind kept replaying the image of that hooded figure, motionless, staring at my doorknob. I took a long sip of wine, hoping it would settle the tension twisting in my stomach. It didn't. I tried scrolling on my phone, but every notification sound made me jump. Minutes passed. Eventually, the quiet began to feel natural again. I started to relax. The wine helped. The glow of the TV helped. The silence felt less threatening. For the first time all night, I actually believed the worst was behind me. The quiet didn't last long. I was halfway through my glass of wine when I heard a faint sound. The noise was soft, dull, rhythmic. It sounded like something lightly touching the outside of the house. I got up, holding my breath without realizing it, and listened again. There it was. I stood and started moving toward the hallway, trying to keep my steps quiet. The farther I walked, the colder the air felt. When I reached the family room doorway, I stopped. My eyes adjusted to the darker space, shapes slowly forming. Then I saw him. It was him. He was back. I didn't think. I turned and walked quickly back toward the living room, nearly stumbling as I reached for my phone. My fingers shook so much I dropped it once, before finally dialing. The tapping didn't stop. Even from the hallway, I could still hear it. I pressed the phone to my ear, trying to steady my voice as I gave the operator my address, and told them someone was outside my house. Someone who had been at my door earlier. As I spoke, the tapping changed. Slower, then faster. Then it stopped completely. The sudden silence was worse than the sound. I leaned into the hallway just enough to see the window from a distance. The figure was still there, standing motionless, head slightly tilted, as if listening. Then, without any warning, he turned and walked away into the darkness. I stayed there, gripping my phone, waiting for the police to arrive. The police arrived faster than I expected. I heard the hum of an engine outside, followed by blue and red lights across the walls of my living room. I stayed near the hallway until I saw the silhouette of an officer approaching the front door. I opened the door slowly. 2 officers stood on the porch, one slightly ahead of the other. They asked me to explain everything again, starting from the movement behind the curtains, to the man knocking on my door, to the tapping at the far window. I told them every detail I could remember. His hood, his pale skin, the way he stood, the way he stared at the doorknob. While I spoke, they began checking the area. One walked around the front of the house with a flashlight, sweeping it across the bushes, the driveway, the sidewalk. The other circled around toward the side yard, moving toward the family room window where I'd last seen the figure. I stayed inside the doorway, watching them through the frame. A few minutes later, both officers returned. They hadn't found anyone. No footprints near the window, no signs of forced entry. Nothing disturbed. Before leaving, they told me they would patrol the neighborhood for a while, just in case, and to call again if anything else happened. I thanked them, even though the words felt hollow. When they stepped off the porch and returned to the car, the flashing lights faded, and the street fell quiet again. I closed the door, locked it, then double-checked the lock without even realizing I was doing it. I walked back into the living room, trying to convince myself that things were finally settling down. I didn't believe it, not really, but it was the only thought that kept the room from feeling like it was closing in on me. I sat back on the couch, letting out a shaky breath. The night felt heavy, thick, unmoving. Around 20 or 30 minutes passed after the officers left, and nothing else happened. The house stayed still, heavy, completely silent. I kept the TV on, scrolling through channels until I found something familiar. Anything to make the room feel normal again. I ended up putting on another movie, something I'd already seen a dozen times. The kind of film you don't really need to follow, because you remember every scene anyway. I watched it just to fill the quiet, just to keep my nerves from creeping back up. As the minutes went by, the tension slowly faded. Not entirely, but enough that my breathing stopped feeling tight. The blanket warmed me a little. The wine dulled the edge of my thoughts. By the time the credits rolled, the clock on my phone said 3:02 a.m. The fatigue hit me all at once, not a comfortable tiredness, more like a mental crash after hours of being on high alert. My eyes felt heavy, my limbs warm and sluggish. For the first time since the knocking, I actually considered going to bed and tried to convince myself the night was finally ending. And then, I heard something behind me. It was soft, as if fingernails were grazing paint. My eyes opened wide. The tiredness vanished instantly. I stayed completely still, listening. Then it came again. I stared at the living room door. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, nothing moved. Then the door made a small sound, The door didn't stay still. It began to open, slowly. Then,